Chapter 137. Bella Pav. Bella stepped out of the house, closing the door with a soft click that echoed faintly in the quiet morning. The fresh air wrapped around her instantly, heavy with the damp scent of earth and leaves after the drizzle. That blend of moss and rain was unmistakable, the smell of forks, as persistent as the mist clinging to the rooftops. At the curb, Edward's silver Volvo waited, spotless, gleaming even under the overcast sky. It was as if nothing could dim its presence, not even the gray light that colored the morning. Bella opened the passenger door and climbed in, adjusting her backpack on her lap. As soon as she settled into the seat, Edward greeted her with a smile that lit up his features. "See, I told you I wouldn't take long." Bella answered with a faint smile, though inside her worries still swirled like a storm she didn't know how to quiet. She didn't want to ruin the moment, but the weight of seeing Charlie so broken lingered, pressing against her chest. The engine purred softly, and the car glided down the street with the same graceful control that defined Edward. Silence stretched between them, seemingly comfortable, until Bella couldn't contain her thoughts any longer. In a low, anxious tone, she broke the calm. "Do we really have to keep lying to my dad? I mean, both Nate and I knew about the existence of vampires while we were still human. Don't you think we could make an exception for him?" Edward sighed, as though he'd anticipated the question. His voice was patient but carried an unyielding firmness, leaving no room for negotiation. "The circumstances are different, Bella. You are my partner. Nate stumbled upon us. And you've seen what this secret can do. You nearly died in Phoenix. Nate's grandmother died. Do you really want to put Charlie in that kind of danger?" Bella lowered her gaze to her hands, tightening them on her lap. The logic in Edward's words was undeniable, but her father's anguish weighed heavily than any reasoning. But he was already in danger, and he didn't even know the truth. "I think knowing would give him peace. He feels guilty about what happened. He thinks Nate isn't coming back because he's angry at him." Edward kept his eyes on the road, his profile cut sharply against the pale light filtering through the windshield. His voice hardened, leaving no room for argument. "No, Bella. We can't tell him, not just because of the risk of exposing him to our world. If the Volturi found out, they'd kill him. And our entire coven." A thick silence filled the car. Bella bit her lip, holding back her frustration, but the pressure inside her finally burst out in a rush of words. "Then why do you insist on keeping me human? Nate's already a vampire, isn't he? And being a human who knows the secret puts my life, and your family's, in danger. I'm 18 now, I'm older than you, why not just do it already?" Edward's brow furrowed, and the sweetness of his face tightened. His voice slipped into a tone of irritation he rarely allowed himself. "Bella, things aren't right at the moment. There's the threat of war with the Quileutes. Why are you so insistent? You're perfect as you are. You don't need to change." Bella glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. Love, fear, and frustration swirled within her, suffocating her. To Edward, his words were conviction. To her, they were a wall keeping her from the life she longed to share with him, free of limits and secrets. Frowning, her voice tight with frustration, she replied. "All the more reason to change me. If I were a vampire, no one could keep me away from you. Besides, graduation is near, I'd have to leave Forks for college anyway." Her words hung heavy between them. Edward, who had managed to keep calm until then, raised his voice for the first time. His golden eyes flashed with contained anger, his body tense like a coiled spring. "Bella, don't you realize what you're saying? Leaving Forks isn't the same as giving up your human life completely. You can't talk about that decision as if it were just a simple change of city." Bella's reply tumbled out, desperate. "You don't understand. I keep aging. Right now it's fine, but soon the gap will grow wider. My body will grow weaker, uglier, until one day you won't even be able to look at me. And it won't stop here. First it's the Quileutes, then it'll be something else. There will always be something trying to tear us apart. I don't want to be helpless, I want to fight by your side. Alice turned Nate into a vampire, why can't you do the same?" Edward gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles pale and rigid. His voice carried the weight of conviction. "I would love you even if you were twice my age, Bella. And it's precisely because I love you that I don't want to turn you. Being a vampire isn't as wonderful as you imagine, we are soulless monsters. You are beautiful just the way you are, and I wouldn't condemn anyone to my fate if I had the choice." Bella tried to argue, but Edward continued, his eyes still fixed on the road. "And just so it's clear, I shouldn't even tell you this, but I know you won't drop the subject otherwise, Alice didn't turn Nate into a vampire. She was just as surprised as you when she found out. Bella felt a hollow emptiness in her stomach. All this time, she'd exchanged messages with Alice, always assuming she had been the one to change him. The revelation stole her breath. Her voice trembled when she managed to speak. Then, how did he change? Or rather, who did it? Edward shook his head, his jaw rigid. We don't know. He just appeared in Seattle as a vampire. I asked Carlisle, but he wouldn't say anything. According to my family, he's not the same person anymore. Silence once again filled the car, heavier than before. Bella wanted to push, to demand answers, but the words died in her throat. Edward pulled up in front of the school and switched off the engine, his gestures calm, almost mechanical. He stepped out, and with his usual unshakable grace, came around to open her door. As they walked toward the entrance together, Edward lowered his voice, almost as if sharing a secret. After school, we'll go to my house. Carlisle wants to talk to you about something important. Bella looked at him, startled, but didn't dare ask. A chill ran through her. Deep inside, fear clung to the idea that Carlisle might be about to tell them they had to leave, that Edward would have to abandon her for everyone's safety. And though Edward had promised 1,000 times that nothing would separate them, part of her heart feared that, sooner or later, he'd realize she was just human, fragile, fleeting, replaceable. That feeling of uncertainty stayed with her as they walked through the school doors. Bella clung to the quick kiss they shared before parting, as if that brief touch could sustain her through the day, before she hurried off to class. The school hours dragged on with almost unbearable monotony for Bella. The atmosphere buzzed with the mix of excitement and anxiety that always filled the days before graduation. Hallways buzzed with talk of bright futures, prestigious universities, or eagerly awaited first jobs. Every group seemed to have its own plan, its own dream just beginning to take shape. For Bella, though, all of it felt distant, as if belonging to another reality. Her focus slipped easily, her notes forgotten in her notebook, while the constant chatter around her felt foreign. Her thoughts remained caught in her conversation with Edward in the car, the half-truths she'd uncovered, and the growing weight of uncertainty about her future. When lunch finally arrived, Bella breathed with relief, though the thought of sitting with Edward and the Cullens weighed on her. After their argument, she felt he needed space, at least for a few hours. She would see him after school and again at his house later, which was enough comfort to make her decide to sit with Jessica and the others instead. With her tray in hand, she walked to the table where Angela sat comfortably, leaned into Eric, both smiling with effortless affection. Jessica was distracted, eyes glued to her phone, scrolling quickly. Tyler, who had joined the group recently, chatted animatedly. Mike, however, no longer sat with them. Since his breakup with Jessica, he had almost completely distanced himself. Bella had heard rumors that Jessica had flirted with another guy at a cafe months ago, and Mike had decided to cut ties for good. Since then, he sought company in other groups, occasionally sitting with Eric. Bella sat down next to Angela, greeting her with a small smile. The conversation flowed with light comments until Eric, his eyes sparkling with excitement, shared news he could barely contain. Angela and we got accepted into a university near Washington, D.C. The thrill in his voice was contagious. Bella smiled as Angela nodded sweetly, confirming the news. That's amazing. Bella exclaimed, genuinely happy for them. It comforted her to know that at least some of her friends wouldn't have to separate as they stepped into the future. Jessica, barely lifting her eyes from her phone, muttered a dry, congratulations, paired with a forced smile. Bella noticed her gaze drifting constantly toward Mike's table, where he sat chatting with a couple of teammates. Eric, oblivious to the tension, went on enthusiastically. We honestly didn't think we'd both get in, but it all worked out perfectly. I'm so happy. I still can't believe it. As the excitement lingered, Eric turned slightly to Bella, lowering his voice as though he didn't want the others to overhear. Hey, Bella, do you know if Nate has a new number? I know the last thing he wants is anything to do with Forks, but, since I'll be in DC, I thought it'd be cool to have a friend there. Nate's name hit Bella like a weight in her stomach. She swallowed hard and lowered her gaze before answering with a touch of sadness. No, sorry, Eric. I know as much as you do. I haven't heard from him either. Eric nodded, disappointed, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. That's when Jessica, half listening, lifted her head from her phone and tossed out a remark dripping with disdain. Please, if he wanted to stay in touch, he would have texted or something. Forget about him. He's probably not even in DC anymore. Most likely, he ran off with that Cullen girl, and we'll never hear from him again. The table fell silent at once. Even Tyler, usually carefree, looked away awkwardly. Bella, at first, considered letting it slide. She repeated it to herself, it's not worth the fight. But something inside her pushed back. It wasn't just about Nate, it was about Jessica's cruel way of masking her bitterness with sarcasm. Calmly, Bella picked up her tray and stood. The movement caught Jessica's eye, who frowned. What now? She asked with irritation. Bella met her gaze, her voice steady but firm. I hate it when you act like this. And the fact that you messed things up with Mike isn't an excuse to be nasty to everyone else. The tension froze in the air, cold and uncomfortable. Jessica opened her mouth, ready to snap back, but no words came. Angela, still holding Eric's hand, lowered her gaze, uneasy, while Tyler shrugged, clearly unwilling to get involved. Bella didn't wait. She took her tray and walked off, the muffled murmurs of her classmates buzzing faintly behind her. She strode toward the trash bin, barely having touched her food, though her appetite was the last thing on her mind. She knew she'd overreacted with Jessica, but she didn't regret it. Since her breakup with Mike, Jessica had been unbearable, and Bella had too many real problems to deal with teenage drama. When she reached the bin, she lifted her eyes, and met Edward's gaze from across the cafeteria. His expression was calm, but his golden eyes studied her closely, as if he could read everything she was trying to hide. He made a small move to get up, ready to go to her, but Bella raised her hand, signaling him not to bother. She didn't want to talk about it now, much less in the middle of the cafeteria. She dropped the tray into the bin and, without looking back, decided to spend the rest of lunch in her next classroom. The following hours passed with a deceptive swiftness. Maybe it was because her mind was too busy wandering, jumping from worry to worry. In the class she shared with Edward, he simply sat beside her, holding her hand in a silent attempt to calm her. Bella knew he had heard the entire conversation in the cafeteria, she could sense it in his silence, in the way his fingers remained laced with hers, never letting go. She chose not to say anything until classes were over. When the final bell rang, Bella gathered her things and walked with Edward toward the parking lot. On the way, Emmett, Rosalie, and Jasper passed them. It was Jasper who, in an unusually grave tone, said to Edward, "We'll see you at home. Don't take too long." Edward nodded without a word. Bella noticed the seriousness on all their faces. Even Emmett, who always had a quick smile or a light-hearted comment, kept his jaw tight and his brow furrowed. The tension in the air was undeniable, and though no one explained anything, Bella felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Edward, as always, opened the car door for her with perfect courtesy. Bella settled into the seat while uncertainty gnawed at her. During the drive, she could no longer hold back her nerves. Is everything okay? Do you know what Carlisle wants to tell me? Your brothers seemed too serious. Edward kept his eyes on the road for a few seconds before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. Don't worry. They're just a little on edge. We caught the scent of a Quileute near the school. We don't like being watched. As for Carlisle, I think it's better if he explains it himself. Bella nodded, trying to look as though she understood, though inside her anxiety only grew. The idea of Carlisle wanting to speak to her directly weighed on her chest, as though something final was about to be revealed. Halfway home, Edward pulled into a gas station. He went inside quickly and returned with something for Bella to eat. I noticed you didn't eat anything at school, he explained with a soft smile. She accepted the package without much enthusiasm. She knew he was right, but she also suspected this stop was an excuse, to give his family time to gather before they arrived. She chewed distractedly, eager to push through the tension that hung over her. The rest of the drive passed in silence. With her forehead resting against the window, Bella found herself scanning the forest along the roadside. She couldn't help wondering if a wolf was trailing them, hidden in the trees. She saw nothing, which gave her a small measure of relief, though she knew the calm never lasted long. Minutes later, the car rounded the last bend, and the majestic facade of the Cullen house appeared, rising among the deep green of the forest. Unlike other times, the sight didn't fill her with wonder but with a cold premonition. As they got out of the car, Edward gave Bella a serene smile. Don't worry, it's nothing too important. Bella nodded, though not fully convinced. They walked to the entrance together. Aware of the tension in the air, Bella strained her ears, hoping to catch some murmur from inside. But there was nothing. Everything was disturbingly quiet. Crossing the threshold, she immediately felt the charged atmosphere in the dining room. The Cullen family was gathered there. Rosalie had her head resting on Emmett's shoulder. He kept his arms crossed and tapped his foot impatiently against the floor. Jasper lingered in a corner of the kitchen, his gaze distant, as though fighting thoughts he wouldn't share. Esme, in contrast, offered Bella a small, warm smile as soon as she entered, though even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. Carlyle, leaning against the kitchen counter, straightened the moment he noticed her. His voice, as always, was calm and kind. Bella, I'm glad you could come. We have matters to discuss. She nodded, a lump in her throat, and moved closer to the dining area, sitting down in one of the empty chairs. Edward positioned himself beside her, slipping an arm around her shoulders in a protective gesture. Carlyle waited until Bella was settled before continuing. As you know, tensions with the Quileutes have escalated. They're not only circling around my work in the school, but they seem to be moving everywhere we are. Rosalie lifted her gaze and added with disdain. It's as if they're just waiting for the right moment to attack. Carlyle didn't react to her comment. He simply went on, maintaining his composure. Honestly, the situation is very concerning. At first, I thought the best course was to meet them at the borders of our territory and try to talk with them one last time. But there's been a small change of plans. Bella's eyes burned as tears began to gather. Her voice came out low, trembling. You're leaving, aren't you? Edward reacted instantly. He drew her closer and spoke with firm conviction. No, Bella. I've discussed this with my family, and there's no way I'll leave you alone. That's out of the question. Bella looked at him with a flicker of hope but quickly turned her attention back to Carlyle. Then, what will happen? Carlyle lowered his voice, as if the words carried too much weight. Our best option is to convince one of the Quileutes to listen to us. If we can get one of them to plant out among the rest, it'll be the first step toward peace. Unfortunately, none of them wants to hear us, so we're placing all our hopes on Jacob. Since he hasn't been transformed long, we believe his hatred toward us might not be so deeply rooted yet. Bella felt a spark of hope, but it quickly faded. I've already tried to talk to him, but they won't let me near. Even Billy has been ignoring my father. I don't see how I could reach Jacob. Carlyle nodded calmly. We know, Bella. No one blames you for that. There was a brief pause before he continued, his expression caught between duty and compassion. As you recall, Alice called me last night. I didn't want to tell you immediately because it's a delicate matter, but they've decided to come to Forks, and they'll be here very soon. Bella's eyes lit up at once. They're coming. Then Nate, too. That's perfect. There's no way Jacob would refuse to talk to him. A rush of relief spread through her chest. Nate's presence always had that effect, the sense that no problem was impossible to solve. And deep down, Bella also felt a flicker of excitement. She missed him terribly, and now that he was a vampire, she had 1,000 questions for him. She wanted to catch up, to understand him. As if reading her thoughts, Carlyle raised a hand to capture her attention. The issue, Bella, is that we don't know how many days he'll stay here. But we don't think it will be long. That's why, at least for a few days, the safest thing would be for you to avoid this house. It would also be better if you didn't spend much time with Edward. I promise it won't be more than a week. Just the time necessary to resolve this. Bella reacted immediately. Her expression twisted into something close to betrayal. Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. Finally, with a voice cracked by disbelief, she spoke. Wait, what? You can't ask me that. At the very least, I want to talk to him. Her protest echoed in the silence of the room like a bell tolling, bouncing against the walls and the heavy air. Edward cut in quickly, as though afraid her reaction would ignite a fire he'd be forced to contain. His voice was laden with sorrow, deep and heavy, every word weighing as much for him to say as it did for her to hear. I'm sorry, Bella, but you must understand. As I've told you before, nothing is easy for us. Being near you could be dangerous for his self-control. I've been a vampire for a century, and it was still an agonizing task not to attack you when we first met. For a newborn, it would be 1,000 times worse. Edward's words hung between them like a poisoned reminder of the dangers that always threatened their relationship. Bella lowered her gaze, her hands trembling in her lap as she tried to process his warning. She understood, yes, but inside, a spark of defiance burned brighter. But we're talking about Nate, she murmured, barely audible, as though his very name was a charm that protected her. She lifted her eyes, pleading. He's my friend. He would never hurt me. Edward tensed, lips parting to reply, but Carlyle interrupted. His voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through too many years and too many horrors to allow wishful thinking. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't be so strict. With Jasper's abilities and Emmett's presence, it would be enough to restrain a newborn. But Nate's case is different, even the Denali confirmed my suspicions. Even if all of us tried to stop him, I'm not sure we could. Bella's eyes widened in disbelief, a shiver running down her spine. Instinctively, she sought confirmation. First, she turned to Jasper. Always stoic, always composed, he simply nodded and lowered his gaze, as though the certainty weighed too heavily. That small gesture alone formed a lump in Bella's throat. Then she looked to Emmett. He, who always radiated strength and confidence, who never seemed to fear anything, this time, he averted his eyes, uneasy, uncomfortable, almost ashamed to admit with his silence what Carlyle had said aloud. The air in the room grew thick, dense as smoke. Heat burned in Bella's cheeks as she turned desperately to Edward, hoping to see some trace of disagreement, some crack in the wall of certainty, anything to give her hope. But his face was set, his golden eyes, though shining with love and concern, were serious and unyielding, as though silently swearing that he, too, believed what had been said. The urge to argue surged inside her. She wanted to insist Nate would never hurt her, that she knew him better than they did, that their friendship was stronger than bloodlust. But she stopped herself. The knot in her throat tightened, and her breath turned ragged. She couldn't demand more from them. The fact that the Cullen family wasn't leaving Forks was already an enormous concession, a gift she didn't dare put at further risk. She took a deep breath, forcing her hands to steady. Then, in a low voice that barely masked her defeat, she looked up at Carlyle. It'll only be a few days, right? Carlyle offered her a serene smile, calm crafted from patience and compassion. The faint curve of his lips felt like a caress in the middle of a storm. Yes, Bella. Just until Nate speaks with Jacob. She nodded, though her chest burned with doubt. Cooperative, yes, but with her heart torn. With a steady voice, she added. Just, please, when he comes, tell him to answer my calls. I've tried reaching him through Alice's phone, but he won't pick up. Carlyle inclined his head slowly, his gaze that of a physician well acquainted with the suffering of his patients. I promise. I'll give him your message. A solemn silence fell over the room, enveloping them all like a veil. Each member of the family reacted differently, but they all shared the same thing, expectation. The sense of standing on the brink of an inevitable change. Chapter 138. The journey from Alaska to Forks had passed in the blink of an eye. For a human, it would have been a distance demanding entire days on the road. For Nate and Alice, running at the maximum speed their bodies could withstand, it was nothing more than a prolonged blink. Less than a day after departing, they were already skirting the damp, eternally green forests that heralded their proximity to Forks. The humid air of Washington hit their skin differently. There was a distinct scent in the atmosphere, a mix of wet earth and salt from the nearby sea. Nate sensed it with every inhalation, but his face remained serene, almost impassive. On the outside, he seemed calm. Inside, however, a turbulent river of thoughts and memories dragged him uncontrollably. Alice, on the other hand, could not hide her concern. Every so often, she glanced at him from the corner of her eye, with that gaze of hers that seemed to read not only the present but possible futures as well. Nate did not need to hear her to understand what was running through her mind. He knew his self-control was not yet perfect. Spending long stretches in a populated area, surrounded by human scents, was testing a muscle that had only just begun to strengthen. When they neared Port Angeles, they stopped. The silence of the forest closed in around them, broken only by the crunch of branches beneath their feet. Alice was the first to speak, organizing the details with a precision that seemed rehearsed. My family says the Quileute have been watching their every move. We can't just walk into Forks like nothing's happening. If they mistake us for nomads, they might attack. Nate tilted his head, considering. He wasn't worried about fighting. He knew what he was capable of, and inside him, that certainty burned like red-hot iron. But he also understood what was at stake. If he were to injure one of the wolves, even unintentionally, the fragile peace talks between the Cullens and the Quileute would shatter into pieces. They ended up settling at the outskirts of Port Angeles, where the city blended into the forest. There, amid the thickets, they remained like statues, motionless, while Alice pulled out her phone with a quick, natural, almost mechanical gesture. She dialed Carlyle. The patriarch's voice answered immediately, calm as always, but with a hint of expectation hidden between the syllables. Understood. Stay there. We'll send someone to guide you. In the meantime, we'll disperse. It's better that the Quileute don't sense your arrival. If any of them discover that Nate is here, they could pressure Jacob into refusing to speak with him. That contact must be made discreetly, by surprise. Alice nodded silently, though Nate, listening to every word, barely pressed his lips together. He exhaled softly, as if releasing a weight he had carried in his chest. For him, the idea was simpler. Enter the reservation directly, find Jacob, and speak to him face to face. He was convinced that with Jacob present, no conflict would erupt. And even if it did, Nate knew, with the cold certainty that came with his new immortality, that he could walk away unscathed. Minutes passed slowly as they remained still in the forest. The wind carried the scent of the sea, and the distant calls of birds mingled with the whisper of leaves. It was Alice who broke the silence, her voice calm, though her eyes scrutinized him with unease. How are you? Nate blinked, surprised by the question. He had been so absorbed in his thoughts that he hadn't noticed Alice's steady gaze, one eyebrow raised in expectation. Before he could answer, she lowered her voice slightly and clarified. I mean, about returning to Forks. The words lingered in the air, heavy with invisible weight. The name of that place had the power to awaken innate memories of another life, faces, laughter, promises. And among them all, one in particular shone brighter than the rest. Nate quickly suppressed the thought. He didn't want to worry his partner any further. With a serene smile, tinged with slight fatigue, he replied to Alice, I'm fine. These aren't the conditions under which I wanted to return, but I think I can handle it, though, to be honest, I'd rather resolve this quickly and finally start hunting Riley. Alice nodded slowly, her eyes reflecting understanding and some concern. She knew that at that moment, Nate was still not ready to fully immerse himself in his family's lifestyle. This small mission was merely a temporary stop, a precautionary step before he could reintegrate completely. Her mind calculated every risk, but her heart, though outwardly unshakable, longed for the closeness she could not relinquish. With determined movements, Alice approached Nate and embraced him, resting her head against his firm chest. Nate returned the hug without hesitation, feeling the intensity of his own contained strength. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, thoughts, and plans to execute, but Alice's proximity gave him a brief respite from his worries. The touch of her hair against his chest, the contact of their skin, it all seemed to hold time in a perfect instant. They stayed like that, motionless, like statues in the shadowy forest night, letting Washington's damp breeze caress their faces and stir the leaves around them. Finally, Nate lifted his gaze, focusing on the horizon with a hard, measured expression. He stepped away from Alice slowly and, in a flat, almost indifferent tone, said, Looks like they sent your sister for us. Alice's eyes immediately lit up. Anticipation electrified her chest, and the forest air seemed to fill with expectation. Only seconds later, the unmistakable scent of Rosalie drifted through the trees, mingling with the fresh smell of damp earth. The sound of rushing air heralded her arrival before they could see her. Rosalie appeared through the forest mist, impeccable as always, her imposing and elegant presence dominating the surroundings effortlessly. When she laid eyes on Alice, a natural smile appeared on her face, a mixture of joy and relief that seemed to soften the sharpness of her features. Without losing a moment, she extended her arms and hugged her sister tightly, letting the connection between them fill the air with intense, familiar warmth. Alice returned the hug, feeling each worry dissipate for a moment in the safety of the reunion. Rosalie's eyes shone with a faint light, as if this brief meeting had awakened a contained relief after weeks of invisible tension. I'm glad to see you, she said, her voice caressing each word softly, almost like a whisper blending with the forest's humid air. Then, slowly, she turned her gaze to Nate. Her tone shifted, becoming more formal and courteous, with a calculated edge that betrayed no emotion. Welcome back, Nate. Nate responded with a slight nod, aware of the attention Rosalie was giving him. He noticed in her eyes a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, as if she were trying to read every thought, like a feline evaluating every move before deciding its next step. He sighed softly, acclimating to this new coven would require starting from scratch. Though he had already lived with the Cullens, he had never felt completely comfortable. Carlyle and Esme inspired trust and affection, although he didn't fully share Carlyle's life philosophy, he couldn't deny that seeing them evoked nostalgic memories of his own parents. Emmett, with his open and reliable energy, was also easy for Nate to relate to. His simplicity and uncomplicated nature were pleasing. But the others, they were more uncertain territory. Rosalie had always looked at him with some disdain, and although he knew how to handle it, now that his emotions were more intense, he wasn't sure he could avoid friction. However, from what he perceived, this time she seemed cautious, measuring each word and gesture as if aware that a comment or unpleasant action could awaken something dark in Nate. Then there was Jasper. Although he had never had a relationship with Alice, it was evident that his feelings for her remained silent but noticeable. Nate wasn't jealous, but he couldn't deny that his mere presence acted as a constant reminder of what might have been, a shadow slipping into every thought. And Edward, the matter with Edward was even more complicated. Nate had promised himself to remain indifferent, especially for Alice, but every time his mind conjured Edward, he felt a spark of anger flare in his chest, difficult to ignore, difficult to control. He remained lost in thought for a few seconds, reviewing every detail, every gesture, every shared silence with the family. Finally, he shook his head slightly, trying to clear the tangle of emotions, and with a polite, almost mechanical smile, asked, "Shall we go?" Rosalie nodded with elegance, letting her shiny hair move gently in the night breeze, and indicated they should follow her. Alice wasted no time, taking Nate's hand, and together they began to run after Rosalie, moving with feline agility through the forest shadows. Every step was sure and calculated, a reminder of their immortal nature, while the humid night air caressed their faces and the wind's whisper among the trees accompanied their movements, creating a hypnotic rhythm that marked their path toward the Cullen house. The closer they got to the Cullen house, the more forks, memories struck Nate's mind. The forest's humidity, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, all transported him to his past. But more than any memory of the place, his thoughts centered on his grandmother. Just imagining her sparked an urgent feeling, an impulse to pass by his old home, almost hoping that, upon opening the door, she would be there to greet him. The image was so vivid that for a moment, his steps slowed, and for a second, time seemed to stop. However, he soon shook his head. He knew the house had been empty for a long time, and he was the only surviving member of his family. The certainty hurt like a cold seeping to the bone, a reminder of the loneliness that had enveloped him since attaining immortality. Alice, sensing his silent sadness, gently squeezed his hand. The contact was simple, yet enough to bring a small relief. Nate allowed himself a brief moment of calm. Though he would never see his parents or grandmother again, he would have Alice by his side for all eternity. That thought made him smile faintly, a brief gesture that quickly turned into determination. To secure that future, he needed to resolve many things first. Among them was the reason that had brought him back to Forks. As they advanced, the forest began to clear, revealing the contours of the Cullen house in the distance. Its windows reflected the moonlight, creating a silver halo that seemed to mark the entrance to a world both familiar and distant. Rosalie, walking with calculated elegance, commented cautiously, "Looks like the plan worked, I don't sense any Quileute nearby." Her voice was measured, and her eyes shone with the moonlight's reflection, evaluating every shadow among the trees. Nate sniffed the air with the precision of his vampiric nature, sensing the tranquility emanating from the house. "Nothing smells off," he said, low and confident. "I'm sure Carlyle and Esme are inside." Rosalie hesitated for a moment, scanning the surroundings as if searching for any hint that might contradict the sense of safety. Finally, detecting the familiar scent from inside the house, she nodded slightly, wordlessly. Alice, sensing Nate needed a touch of lightness, crossed her arm with his and, in a cheerful tone contrasting with the tension of the moment, said while looking at Rosalie for confirmation, "It's pretty amazing, isn't it?" Rosalie didn't smile. Her expression remained distant, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, quite." Without further delay, they approached the entrance. The solid wooden door creaked slightly as it opened, and the warm, familiar air of the interior greeted them, mingling with the night breeze still filtering through the doorway. Carlyle and Esme stood at the threshold, the patriarch's figure upright, imposing yet welcoming, and Esme radiating her usual serenity, warmth, and protection. Carlyle received them with his usual calm, enveloping smile, radiating a warmth that seemed to fill the quiet foyer. His eyes shone with a deep, tranquil light, reflecting genuine joy at seeing Nate and Alice. There was a hint of satisfaction in his gaze, as if he truly felt pleased to have them back. Nate couldn't help but notice that this joy wasn't mere courtesy but a sincere emotion emanating from every gesture of the patriarch. "It's been a while, but welcome back home," Carlyle said, his voice as firm as it was gentle, softly resonating between the walls, carrying a comforting warmth that seemed to envelop them and momentarily dispel the tension accumulated from the forest and the journey. Chapter 139. Carlyle stepped forward with open arms, radiating the natural calm that seemed to follow him in every movement. He embraced Alice tenderly, as if no time had passed and their reunion was simply the continuation of an interrupted farewell. He held her briefly, just long enough to convey the warmth of a father finally reclaiming his daughter. Then, with the same ease, he turned to Nate and pulled him into a short but firm hug, accompanied by a couple of friendly pats on the back. Nate didn't feel uncomfortable, but the gesture unsettled him. He didn't share that kind of intimacy with Carlyle, yet he could tell the act wasn't forced, every movement was sincere. Esme, on her part, stepped forward at once, radiant, her eyes shining with a joy that seemed to brighten the entire foyer with her happiness. She welcomed Alice with an embrace overflowing with tenderness, as if her mere presence restored a harmony the house had been missing for far too long. On her face lingered palpable relief, the warm peace of a mother who once again felt her home was whole. Meanwhile, Carlyle's attention was fixed on Nate. His serene, welcoming smile softened his features even further as he spoke. "You look much calmer than the last time we saw each other." Nate noticed how Carlyle's gaze paused on his eyes, still an intense crimson, a stark reminder he hadn't adopted their diet. The thought dragged him back to his stay in Denali, where he had witnessed the gradual change in vampires who gave up human blood, their irises softening with golden hues until they became entirely amber. He thought of Laurent, whom he had once caught at night, attempting, as he sheepishly put it, to cheat on his diet. Nate remembered that nervous, almost embarrassed laugh when he was discovered. He had confronted him, and their talk stretched well into the early morning. In the end, Laurent relented and adapted to the diet. Over time, faint golden flecks appeared in his eyes, a silent testament to discipline. Esme's melodious voice pulled him out of his thoughts. She had approached him with the same warmth she radiated toward everyone, hugging him tightly, without reserve. "Even if it's just a quick visit to solve a problem, I'm so glad to have the family complete again," she said, her eyes shining with a disarming sincerity. An unexpected warmth coursed through Nate's chest. That was what he liked about Esme, the naturalness of her affection. It never seemed forced, never felt like courtesy, everything in her came from genuine care. He nodded slightly, offering a small, discreet smile heavy with gratitude. They were about to begin a more relaxed conversation when Nate picked up the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the woods. His ears caught each cadence, each brush of leaves, and he knew immediately who it was. He released a restrained sigh, resigned, fully aware of what their arrival meant. "Where should I put the bags?" he asked politely, though his eyes stayed fixed on the door. Alice, who seemed to anticipate his thoughts, answered with a light smile. "You can put everything in our room." Carlyle, sensing his other children's approach as well, spoke with serene reassurance. "Make yourselves comfortable. Later, we'll talk in the living room about what we'll do with the rest of the family." Both nodded silently. In a blink, Nate grabbed the bags and vanished toward Alice's room. She followed him with her eyes, though she paused for a moment. Edward, Jasper, and Emmett had just stepped through the door at the same time. Edward was the first to move, clearly intending to greet her warmly, his joy at seeing her again evident. Jasper and Emmett followed, eager as well. But Alice raised a hand slightly and gave them a small, apologetic smile. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said softly, and in the next instant, she disappeared, racing after Nate. She slipped into her room and paused, letting her gaze wander across every corner. Everything was exactly as she had left it, her paintings carefully arranged on the shelf, her records neatly stacked, her wardrobe filled with clothes that seemed to mirror every facet of her personality. A gentle smile curved her lips, there was comfort in seeing her space intact, as if time had stood still and the room preserved a part of her. Nate stood in the middle of the room, the bags at his feet. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze was distant, lost in a storm of invisible thoughts. Alice approached quietly, setting her own bags down, and placed a soft hand on his shoulder, noticing the tension still running through his body. "I know you're not completely comfortable, especially with Edward, but please, treat them kindly. They're my family," she whispered, her voice low and careful, filled with affection and sincerity. Nate sighed, letting the warmth of her touch reach him. He placed his hand gently on her cheek and replied, his voice firm yet honest. "I'll do my best to get along, or at least to feign indifference." Alice smiled, deeply moved to see Nate struggle against his temper. She knew how hard it was for him to keep his composure, yet she trusted he would try. Nate glanced around the room, trying to sound lighter as his eyes swept over the familiar details. We'll need to buy a bed. Alice laughed softly, almost a murmur blending into the quiet air of the room. We'll only be here a few days. Nate understood immediately, but couldn't help looking at her intently, as if seeking silent permission or an unspoken answer. Alice shook her head and bit her lower lip playfully. You're right, I'll ask one of my brothers to buy one for us in town. For a moment, the room filled with intimate stillness. The noise outside faded, and only the two of them existed, sharing a quiet complicity. Alice wanted to prolong it, but she kept glancing at the door. A smile of apology tugged at her lips, unable to contain her excitement any longer. Will you excuse me a second? I left my brothers waiting, I want to greet them. She was heading for the door when Nate followed at a calm pace, remarking casually. I'll greet them too, besides, everyone's already in the living room. They're just waiting for us to make the plan. Crossing the door together gave them another fleeting moment of complicity, their eyes meeting briefly as they entered the living room, where the entire Cullen family had already gathered. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows that danced across walls and furniture. The dimness wrapped the room in an intimate, mysterious air, where every movement and gesture seemed sharper beneath the silver glow of the night. Those who hadn't yet greeted Alice approached at once, drawn to her presence. Emmett moved first. With his usual boundless energy, he rushed forward, scooped her into a hug, and lifted her slightly off the ground, spinning her in a small circle. Alice let out a clear laugh that mingled with the nighttime stillness of the house, and Nate couldn't help but smile at the familiar sight. Emmett's joy seemed to warm the room, a bright spark against the coldness of the night. Jasper came next. His steps were fluid and measured, almost ethereal under the moonlight filtering in. His greeting was brief and restrained. I'm truly glad to see you well. The hug was short but sincere. Jasper withdrew gently, stepping back. Nate watched closely, a faint spark of discomfort stirring inside him, though he forced himself to contain it. Keeping calm was difficult, especially since he had to focus on keeping his mind blank, inaccessible to Edward's gift. Edward lingered at a distance, his eyes gleaming under the moonlight, fixed on Nate and Alice. His gaze carried caution, anticipation, and a trace of guilt. He seemed ready to approach, but hesitated, as if waiting for Nate to make the first move. Nate barely glanced at him, offering only a polite smile before returning his attention to Emmett. Amused, Emmett stepped closer to Nate. With a wide grin, he joked in a jovial tone. Look at you, you don't seem so terrifying anymore. How've you been? He extended his hand for a shake, and Nate responded with firmness and courtesy, as still as a statue beneath the silver light. In playful defiance, Emmett tightened his grip, but Nate remained unmoved. Noticing Emmett's effort, Nate began squeezing back. The pressure drew a sharp gasp from Emmett, who quickly pulled his hand away, half in surprise, half in pain. Wow, that strength's not even fair. Nate shook his head slightly, replying calmly. Technically, I'm still a newborn. Jasper, observing from the side, stepped forward as if waiting for his turn, speaking with polite sincerity. It's good to have you back, Nate. Nate gave him a slight nod, acknowledging the gesture without words. All the while, Edward stayed motionless, his gaze locked on him, analyzing every expression and movement beneath the night's glow. The tension was thick, almost tangible, everyone could feel the unease between Nate and Edward, as if a single misplaced word could spark something dangerous. At last, just as Edward seemed ready to approach, Carlyle raised his voice with his usual composure. Well, now that we're all here, he said, motioning for Edward to take a seat. It's time to plan exactly what we'll do. Nate stepped forward, immediately drawing everyone's attention. His voice rose with frankness, leaving no room for misunderstanding. I'll be honest. I can't stay too close to town for long. My control has improved, but there could still be an accident. I think it's best if I go directly into the reservation and look for Jacob. Esme, who had been listening carefully, shook her head softly before replying with calm concern. That's not a good idea, Nate. We don't know how many wolves there are, they could hurt you. Alice reacted instantly, her eyes igniting with determination as she took a small step forward, as if her words themselves were a shield. Then I'll go with him. Jasper, who until then had remained quietly observant, frowned. A shadow of disapproval deepened on his face as he spoke. I don't think that's a good idea. You could get hurt, Alice. The atmosphere tensed at once. A spark of irritation flashed through Nate, barely contained, like a growl straining to break free. His reply was sharp, authoritative, heavy with conviction that allowed no contradiction. Nothing will happen to her if she's with me. His eyes were cold, but when they met Alice's, his expression softened. He exhaled and spoke more calmly. I think it would be better if I went alone. I'd draw less attention. And honestly, I doubt the wolves could hurt me. Edward broke the silence next, though his voice carried unease, tinged with worry. You don't know what you're saying, Nate. Wolves are almost as strong as vampires. Nate barely turned his head toward him, shooting a quick, icy look before replying, his tone low but razor sharp. You're the one who doesn't know what he's talking about. The words landed like a heavy stone. The tension thickened in the room, the Cullens stayed still, their eyes darting between them as if afraid a wrong move could ignite a fight. Jasper acted quickly. An invisible pulse of calm spread from him to Nate, wrapping him in a serene wave. Nate felt it clearly, like a cold weight settling over his emotions, dampening the fire that wanted to break free inside him. Under other circumstances, he might have brusquely told Jasper to stop. But this time, he didn't. He let it happen, if only for Alice's sake. His shoulders relaxed slightly before he spoke again, his tone steadier. If the Quileute are tracking you, then the best thing is for you all to just go about your day as usual. Edward saw Jacob transformed, right? We just need him to give us the exact description of what he looks like. If any of you spot him lurking, all you need to do is head into the woods and call me immediately. I know Jacob, the moment he sees me, he'll want to talk. Edward stayed silent for a few seconds, his expression conflicted, as if each word weighed heavier than it should. Finally, he spoke, though his voice carried a note of doubt. For some reason, the Quileute don't follow me. At first, I thought they had figured out my gift, but that seems unlikely. Carlyle theorizes it's because I spend all my time with Bella, and they don't want to appear transformed in front of her. So I don't know how useful I'll be. Nate nodded slightly, though a flicker of frustration darkened his face, betraying how much the situation grated on him. Sensing the tension rising again, Carlyle clapped his hands once, a dry sound that cut through the charged air. His voice, calm and firm, drew everyone back into focus. Now that we have a plan, the best thing is to put it into motion right away. Everyone will head to different parts of town. As soon as someone sees a wolf matching Jacob's description, you'll know what to do. Chapter 140. Almost all of the Cullens had left the house. Although the night stretched quietly over the forest, the family was certain that some Quileute were still lurking at a distance. The cold air slipping through the cracks seemed to carry with it a trace of invisible hostility, as if the wind itself bore the threat of the wolves. Only Nate, Alice, Edward, who had no reason to join the plan, and Jasper, who had insisted on staying as soon as he knew Edward would, remained in the living room. The four of them stood there, so still they seemed like marble statues, shadows guarding the silence. For Nate, the atmosphere was suffocating. He felt every second stretch like an over-tightened rope. Fate, or perhaps sheer chance, had condemned him to share that space with the two people he most wanted to avoid. Edward watched him with an uncomfortable intensity, as if the mere act of looking at him could somehow force him to start a conversation. Jasper, on the other hand, maintained a calmness that was even more unbearable. His stillness was that of someone containing far too much beneath the surface. Alice, as if she perceived none of the tension, clung to Nate's arm with a radiant smile that disarmed any shadow. We could go to my room to pass the time, she said, in that light tone that always seemed to open windows in the middle of confinement. Nate looked at her and could not help but return her smile. He agreed without overthinking it, though in doing so, he noticed out of the corner of his eye Jasper's slight frown. A fleeting gesture, but as evident as a crack in glass. Nate understood immediately. Sooner or later, he would have to talk to him. Unlike the conflict with Edward, a much deeper wound, poisoned with resentment, Jasper's issue was one that might be resolved with frank words. Before he could organize his thoughts, Alice gently pulled him toward the room. Inside, the air shifted. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if the tension dominating the living room could not penetrate those walls. Nate always felt that time moved differently when he was with Alice, what were actually hours melted into minutes. He recalled one of the conversations he had had with Eleazar, one of those phrases that stuck with him. For a vampire, the love for their mate hardly ever faded, it was like living in an eternal honeymoon. The idea fascinated him, almost absurdly so, considering how bloody the nature of their species could be. In that intimate space, they devoted themselves to what seemed trivial on the surface but held unexpected weight for Nate. Alice showed him some of the clothes she still kept, pieces that spoke of bygone eras and forgotten fashions. Then, laughing, they improvised with brushes and canvases. Nate even painted her. He found it ironic to capture on canvas a face that would never change, yet he discovered there was nothing repetitive in it. Every stroke revealed something new. There was something in Alice that constantly transformed, not in her appearance, but in that elusive spark that shone in her gaze. Perhaps, he thought, that was what made eternity bearable. For a few hours, Nate allowed himself to forget. The spark of anger that had accompanied him since his arrival at the house gradually dimmed. In its place, he found peace, a strange breath of calm in the midst of the whirlwind. Dawn was beginning to peek over the horizon when the Cullens returned. The sound of their steps, firm yet silent, filled the entrance. Those who had remained in the house stepped out to greet them, eager to hear any results. But a mere glance at their expressions was enough to understand that there was no good news. Carlyle spoke in a grave, though calm, voice as always. None of us saw a wolf with a copper-colored coat. According to Edward, Jacob, in his wolf form, was massive and of an unmistakable copper color, but none of those who had followed them matched that description. Nate, however, was not surprised. I didn't expect you to succeed on the first night, he said calmly. It's okay. One by one, the Cullens began to disperse, preparing for their usual activities. The children got ready for school, Esme had errands to run in town, and Carlyle was going to the hospital. Yet hope lingered. Perhaps that day they might see Jacob. As everyone was about to step out the door, Edward stopped abruptly. He placed a hand on Jasper's shoulder and spoke with an apologetic smile that felt more forced than sincere. Could you tell Bella I have some matters to attend to? I'll stay home today. Jasper nodded without asking questions, though his gaze exuded silent tension. Nate, watching from the corner of his eye, let out a sigh of frustration. He felt Edward searching for any excuse to stay close, and that wore on him more than he cared to admit. Sensing his discomfort, Alice gently squeezed his arm and led him delicately toward the study. Nate didn't understand her intent, but that relaxed smile she maintained disarmed him. There was no room for objections when Alice decided something. As soon as they crossed the doorway, she naturally settled in front of a computer. She turned it on with the routine of someone who no longer thinks about the steps, and the blue glow of the screen tinted her face, bringing out golden sparks in her eyes. You know, she said without looking away, a large part of our fortune comes from this. I use my visions to invest. It's practically guaranteed that we always make great profits. Nate smiled. He walked slowly to stand behind her, leaning enough to feel the light brush of her hair against his arm. Interestingly, when I heard about your visions, I thought of this. It makes sense. Carlyle must earn well as a doctor, but not enough to sustain this lifestyle. For a moment, his attention focused on the screen, expecting graphs, explanations, something to justify her words. But Alice didn't type anything. Instead, she turned her head just slightly and looked at him directly, as if he himself were the only answer that mattered. Nate arched an eyebrow, puzzled. What's wrong? I thought you brought me here to learn. Alice shook her head with a small smile. No. I just wanted to show you how I'll spend my day. I haven't worked in months, so I need to focus. She paused, tilting her head in that way of hers that always seemed to pierce through the surface of things. Also, I thought it might be a good opportunity for you to talk to Edward. It's obvious he stayed because he wants to talk to you. Nate's expression hardened immediately. His brow furrowed, as if the mere mention of the name awakened a tension he had tried to keep buried. He answered with a tone that hinted at doubt. Aren't you worried that if I'm alone with him, I might end up hurting him? Alice looked at him as if he had said something absurd. She didn't laugh or scold him, she simply tilted her head and answered calmly. Not at all. You would never do anything that could affect me. The silence thickened between them. Nate held her gaze for a few seconds, perplexed by the level of trust she placed in him. There was something disarming about that blind faith. It made him feel both unworthy and protected. He took a deep breath, trying to organize what he felt, and walked toward the door. He stopped in the frame, hand resting on the wood. There's something I want to do, so I'll take the opportunity to go with Edward. Maybe I'll talk to him. Alice blinked, surprised. For a moment, it seemed she would stand, but instead, she questioned him calmly. Hey, aren't we supposed to stay hidden? Also, we're in a populated area. You might run into people. Nate shook his head with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Don't worry. I'll just make a quick stop. The Quileute must be too busy following the others. And regarding people, his gaze lingered on the window for a second, as if his mind were already elsewhere. I have enough self-control for what I want to do. Alice's expression softened immediately upon understanding. Her golden eyes filled with tenderness, and Nate felt exposed before them, without barriers. Do you want me to come with you? She asked, with a warmth that seemed to envelop him. Nate shook his head almost in a whisper. No. Later, we'll have a ceremony. Now, I just want to pay my respects. Alice lowered her eyelids slowly, nodding. She did not argue, nor try to stop him. She just accepted. I understand, I won't tell anyone you left. But cover yourself well, in case someone recognizes you. Nate nodded slightly and gave Alice a small parting smile before leaving the study. The hallway was covered in the grayish light filtering through the windows. Forks always seemed to sleep under an overcast sky, and this dawn was no exception. The soft gloom blended with the shadows of the furniture, making each of his steps echo discreetly on the wooden floor. Upon reaching his room, he closed the door behind him and allowed himself a few seconds of stillness. The cloudy air seemed to envelop him, muffling sounds and softening the contours of the room. With deliberate movements, he began searching through his suitcases. Each garment he pulled out and replaced felt like a conscious act of preparation, a ritual connecting him to the calm he tried to maintain. He chose a dark, loose hoodie, perfect for moving without drawing attention. He placed a pair of large sunglasses in a pocket, big enough to completely cover his gaze and hide his red eyes, and pulled a tiny cloth pouch from a side compartment of his backpack, sliding it into his pants pocket. Just feeling it there made him sigh deeply, filled with anticipation. He stopped in front of the mirror, observing himself under the gray light that gave his features a ghostly tone. He inhaled deeply, trying to organize the tension rising from his chest to his throat, and forced himself to walk. The hallway leading to Edward's room stretched with soft, diffuse shadows. At the door, he stopped. The temptation to turn on his heels and leave alone was strong, almost unbearable. He didn't want to rely on anyone, least of all himself. But he also didn't want to disappoint Alice. And deep down, he knew it was wiser to take another vampire with him, someone capable of whisking him away in a blink if he lost control. With a resigned gesture, he raised his hand and knocked. The sound was lost in the murmur of the house. Edward had heard him approach from the other end. Still, he took a moment before opening, as if to hide the fact that he had been waiting. The door opened in a blink, and for a second, they both froze, staring at each other in silence. Edward broke it first, voice loaded with confusion and a hint of hope. Nate, do you need something? Nate held his gaze coldly, his voice flat, measured, almost devoid of emotion. I thought it would be a good idea for us to talk. Edward's eyes widened, and a flash of relief appeared. He had been waiting for this moment, the opportunity to apologize, and now Nate was taking the first step. Of course, Edward saw Ed, stepping aside to open the door further. Come in, please, let's talk. But Nate didn't move. He stayed in the doorway, rigid, like a block of stone. His tone grew sharper as he added. No, not here. Before we talk, I need you to do me a favor. Edward furrowed his brow slightly, hesitating for a moment at Nate's firmness, but nodded. Of course. Whatever you need. Nate's eyes didn't blink. His voice was sharp, almost like an order disguised as a request. I need you to come with me to my old house. Edward flinched slightly, his amber eyes widening as he fixed his gaze on Nate. His voice, loaded with doubt, came quickly. What? Nate, no Quileute is supposed to see you. If we're discovered, the whole plan could fail. Also, there are many people near your house. You know how the thirst is, you could sense someone and not control your impulses before you can stop yourself. Nate's gaze became firm, direct, almost inquisitive. His voice sounded cold, leaving no room for excuses. If you can't come with me, that's fine. But this is happening. I'm going. Edward hesitated just a moment, eyes full of conflict. Concern for safety, the possibility of losing control, and the desire to reconcile with Nate mingled in his expression. Finally, determination prevailed. He couldn't let the opportunity to mend what was broken slip away. Calmly, Edward found a dark jacket on a nearby shelf and put it on with measured movements, making sure to cover himself without showing nervousness. His voice sounded firmer, though still tinged with care. No, I'll go with you. I know a little used route, we'll get there quickly and safely. Nate barely nodded, a nearly imperceptible gesture acknowledging Edward's decision. Without further words, both vampires vanished in a blink, leaving behind the tranquility of the Cullen house and stepping into the gray mist that blanketed Forks. The diffuse light of the overcast sky wrapped every street, tree, and shadow, their senses sharpening with every step. Chapter 141. The forest stretched out like an endless ocean of shadows and dampness. Beneath the overcast Forks sky, the trees stood like silent sentinels, leaning heavily as the wind carried a constant scent of wet earth and resin. Edward ran ahead, agile yet restrained, his movements sharper than usual. Every so often, he turned his head, scanning the surroundings with eyes that seemed to calculate every possible escape route. It was obvious he was nervous, worried that the Quileute might be lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to intercept them. Nate followed closely, his steps firm, gaze fixed straight ahead. He didn't share Edward's unease. His mind was occupied by a single image, a single destination. The mere thought of returning to his old home kept him in a state of iron concentration, as if every tree they left behind didn't just bring him closer to a place, but to a past left unfinished. Suddenly, Edward stopped at a bend in the forest. The silence between them tightened until he raised his hand, pointing to a narrow trail opening through the underbrush. We have to start walking from here. People sometimes use this path. Nate nodded without protest. He let out a slow, measured breath, then shut down his lungs entirely, like someone sealing off a dangerous door. He adjusted the hood of his sweatshirt and settled the dark glasses on the bridge of his nose, concealing every trace of what he truly was. The gesture made him seem even more distant, almost unreachable. The two set off at a human pace. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the faint murmur of a stream were the only sounds that accompanied the weight of their silence. Edward looked conflicted, as though every word he rehearsed fell apart before reaching his lips. Finally, in a restrained, almost uncertain tone, he spoke. Nate, about your grandmother. Nate's response was immediate. He barely turned his head and shook it firmly, without slowing his stride. Let's not talk about that yet. The words hung in the air, solid as a wall. Edward lowered his gaze slightly, respecting the boundary just set. Silence stretched again, heavy, until Nate broke it with a dry sentence, almost as if obliging himself. Tell me how Bella's doing. Edward's change was instantaneous. His eyes, dull moments ago, lit up with a brightness that was hard to contain. A small smile softened his features, as if he had suddenly found solid ground in the middle of a storm. Bella's fine. More than fine, I'd say. Ever since Phoenix, we haven't really been apart. She's spent a lot of time at our house, and I at hers. Even Charlie's gotten used to having me around, he actually seems happy with our relationship. His voice grew more animated as he spoke, as though every memory pushed him to open up further. We even celebrated her birthday. It was at her house. For her, it was a surprise. First, I took her to Port Angeles, kept her distracted so she wouldn't suspect, and when we got back, all her school friends were gathered in the living room with Charlie. You should have seen her face when they switched on the lights and everyone shouted her name. Edward chuckled softly, a sound light and almost musical. His eyes seemed to replay the scene, as if projected before him. She blushed, uncomfortable as always when attention's on her, but happy. She didn't stop smiling the whole night. Angela decorated the living room with lights and flowers. Eric even tried cooking something, with debatable results, but it made her laugh. It was simple, nothing extraordinary, but Bella was radiant. And that's what matters most to me. Nate glanced sideways at him without interrupting. In Edward's tone, there was more than a story. There was adoration, a love so deep it seeped through every word, every pause heavy with tenderness. Edward went on, lowering his voice slightly, as though sharing a secret. She's everything to me. When I'm with Bella, the world feels bearable, even for someone like me. She's made Forks, with all its routine and endless rain, the most important place I could imagine. She has no idea how much she means to me. And maybe that's what makes her so special, the way she gives, the way she simply is, without even trying. Nate didn't take his eyes off the path, but he couldn't help understanding. Edward's words brought him unexpected comfort. He hadn't been there, hadn't shared those moments, but knowing Bella was living joyfully, surrounded by affection and normality, eased some of the weight in his chest. He nodded slightly at Edward's words. I'm glad. Honestly, I thought you'd leave, but it's good you didn't abandon her. The comment made Edward flinch. Those words pierced him with the uncomfortable echo of his own conscience. There was a time, right after the tragedy with Nate's grandmother, when he truly thought about leaving Forks. The idea that his very presence endangered Bella haunted him like a shadow. But then he remembered his last conversation with Nate before leaving for DC. He had promised not to run, to stay, to protect what mattered. He couldn't fulfill the second part of that promise, but he swore to uphold at least the first. That determination was what kept him going now. They walked on, their footsteps muffled by damp earth and fallen leaves blanketing the path. The air smelled of wet bark and pine resin. Nate was beginning to recognize every corner of the terrain, small details that carried him back to a past burning in his chest. They were closer than he expected. Still with Bella in mind, Nate broke the silence. So, have you decided when you'll turn her? The words struck Edward with the harshness of a truth he'd been avoiding for months. His expression tightened, just a grimace revealing his frustration, though his voice remained controlled, as if taming a thought tearing at him. I don't want her to change, Nate. I've been trying for months to explain, but she doesn't understand. The fact that you're already a vampire only encouraged her. The subject doesn't feel taboo anymore. Almost every day, she tells me she wants to be like me. But I don't even want to be this. If it were up to me, she'd stay human, with her soul intact, without having to look in a mirror and see a monster. Nate fixed his gaze on him, his eyes glinting beneath the hood's shadow. His voice came out low, grave, certain, cutting through like ice. I don't share your view. That fantasy of yours ended the moment you agreed to be with her. Do you really think you'll still be together like this in 20 years? You'd only hurt her, Edward. Besides, the power of being a vampire is enough for her to protect herself. All that talk about souls will stop mattering the day a vampire like me shows up, kills her, and you can't do anything about it. The air between them grew heavy, almost electric. Edward felt a pang of rage just imagining that scenario. The thought of Bella hurt ignited a fire inside him. But beyond the anger and anguish, something else took hold in his mind, confusion. What do you mean, a vampire like you? He asked, doubt lacing his tone, as though Nate's words hid more than he was willing to reveal. Nate didn't turn his head this time. His eyes were already fixed on the path ahead, where the trees parted to reveal the familiar silhouette of a street, and beyond it, a house he longed to see again. His voice came sharp, stripped of embellishment. A vampire you can't stop. And with nothing more, he stepped out of the path. Through branches still cloaked in morning mist, the facade of his grandmother's house appeared, untouched, waiting for him like a memory that never stopped hurting. Edward opened his mouth to reply, but fell silent. He could already hear Nate's thoughts clearly. In a lapse, the boy had let some of his mind slip. That made Edward frown. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, Nate had lowered his guard without realizing it. Cautiously, Nate looked both ways down the street. Silence surrounded him. Luckily, he detected no one nearby. His grandmother's house looked as peaceful as it always had, as if time itself had failed to break its calm aura. His feet moved slowly, pulling him toward that place he once lived in, now with new eyes, eyes filtered by eternity. Every step brought him closer, and every detail surprised him. Nate had expected that after so many months of abandonment, the house would be nothing but a shadow of what he remembered. But the sight before him made him shiver. His grandmother's once neglected garden, barely starting to take shape when he first arrived in Forks, now looked transformed by patient, constant hands. Flowers bloomed in clusters of colors, breaking the monotony of green, with even grass and carefully arranged stones. The facade, freshly painted a light blue, stood out against Forks, perpetual mist like a brushstroke of life amid melancholy. Nate paused, surprise etched on his face beneath the sunglasses. Clearly curious, his eyes roamed every corner. Edward, a couple of steps behind, watched him closely before murmuring in a low voice, almost as a reminder. We should go inside. If anyone sees you here, there'll be no doubt about who you are. Nate nodded without protest. Even so, he didn't want to enter through the front door. He didn't have the key now and didn't want to force it. He slipped to the side of the house and, with a light, silent leap, entered through the window of the room that had belonged to his grandmother. As soon as his feet touched the floor, he inhaled instinctively. The air heavy with memories struck his chest. His grandmother's scent still lingered, intact, as if the room had refused to let her go. Everything seemed pristine, frozen in time, just as it had been the last time he saw it. A pang of nostalgia crossed his features. His steps, slow and measured, carried him through the room. Edward, just slipping through the window after him, stayed silent, respecting the moment and giving him space. Nate reached out gently, brushing the objects he found. Among the neatly arranged clothes, he recognized the books on chakras and auras his grandmother had loved. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as he flipped through them. On the nightstand, he found a small quartz bracelet with worn crystals. Taking it in his fingers, he closed his eyes and exhaled, as if the weight of memory itself pushed him backward. He set the bracelet down carefully and left the room. He didn't allow himself to linger in his old bedroom, there was nothing there calling to him now. Instead, he descended the stairs quietly, the wood creaking softly beneath his light steps. The dining room unfolded before him, more familiar than he expected. Nate had imagined ruin, a place reduced to debris after all that had happened. But it wasn't so. The furniture remained in its places, the same forms as always, though his sharpened senses caught the subtle differences. Walls slightly changed, freshly painted or repaired, pieces of furniture restored, shifted only a little. Nate raised an eyebrow, incredulous, seeing how everything remained almost exactly as he remembered. It wasn't a coincidence, someone had been taking care of this house. He was about to ask aloud when a familiar scent, subtle but unmistakable, stopped him cold. In a corner, lying beside a small silver urn on the shelf, rested his grandmother's old tabby cat. A wave of warmth washed over him. He stared in surprise at first, and then slowly, a smile spread across his face, genuine, tender, the kind he rarely allowed himself. Softly, he extended a hand toward the animal, wanting to touch once more that piece of his past. But as soon as the cat lifted its head and recognized him, it hissed sharply, arched its back, and bolted up the stairs. The echo of its paws resounded briefly on the wood until it vanished into the upper floor. Nate's brow furrowed slightly, the smile fading into a shade of disappointment. Then Edward spoke from behind him, his tone low, offering an explanation both obvious and necessary. Most animals fear us. It's instinctive. But if you speak gently to him, he might respond better with you. Nate shook his head, still staring in the direction the cat had fled. Just knowing he's alive is enough. He looks welfed. The words hung there, heavy with forced calm. For a few seconds, he said no more, as if those last syllables were a wall keeping him upright. But soon his gaze drifted back, slowly returning to the shelf. There was the urn. Silver, polished, simple yet solemn, its muted shine catching the dim light filtering through the window. The air seemed to grow denser, time itself contracting around that object. Nate's eyes softened. The hard mask he'd worn since entering the house cracked a little, revealing something more fragile. He stepped closer and, in a low tone, almost as if apologizing, murmured, "Hello, Grandma. It's been a while." The silence that followed was absolute. Edward, standing behind him, didn't dare interrupt. Nate stood still, his gaze fixed on the urn, as if waiting for an impossible answer, as if that simple greeting could cross the abyss that separated him from her. Chapter 142. With slow, almost ceremonial movements, Nate raised his hand and let his fingers barely graze the cold surface of the urn. It wasn't a firm or prolonged touch, but a restrained brush, as if he feared breaking the solemnity of the object with a gesture too abrupt. In that touch, there was more reverence than strength, more nostalgia than anger. Sensing the weight of the moment, Edward stepped back a few paces in silence. He didn't make the slightest sound, he understood this instant didn't belong to him, that he had to limit himself to being an invisible witness. Nate slowly lowered his hood, allowing the faint grayish light filtering through the curtains to wash over his face. Then, with a deliberate motion, he removed his dark glasses. His eyes, a deep crimson red, gleamed with an icy shade that seemed to betray everything he had once been. He smiled with a touch of irony, a broken, almost bitter smile, before speaking. "I know I look different, maybe what bothers me most about these changes is that I no longer have the same eye color as Dad and you." His voice faltered slightly as he spoke those words, but he soon regained firmness, as though forcing himself to stay upright. "As you can see, that's not the only thing that changed. Since you left, life has kept moving forward. Funny, isn't it? I swear, when I heard you were gone, I felt like the world stopped for a moment. But not even losing someone like you can make things stand still forever." The silence of the room enveloped him, heavy and reverent. The old house seemed to hold its breath, listening. Nate let out a faint sigh and, after a few seconds, his lips curved into a brief, soft smile, touched by something that almost resembled tenderness. "Not everything is bad. Even if I can't be close to the people I used to know, I don't feel alone. Alice is with me, and she always will be. I wish you had spent more time with her. When she's near, things look so much better to me. Everything feels less cold. I feel less angry, less disappointed." He lowered his head slightly, and a trace of vulnerability, rarely seen in him, appeared on his face. His voice dropped to a low, almost intimate tone, heavy with confession. "I did a few things you wouldn't be proud of. I found the man who killed Dad." The air in the room grew heavier. Nate fell silent for a few seconds, as if the words resisted coming out, as if biting them hurt more than saying them. At last, his voice emerged, dry, direct, stripped of ornaments. It all happened so fast. Before I knew it, I had already ended his life with my own hands. I think the worst part is that I don't feel guilty anymore. The man begged for his life, even said Dad wouldn't have wanted me to do it. But I didn't care. When I saw the life leave his eyes, all I felt was relief. An ironic smile reappeared on his face, this time tinged with a darker shadow that made him seem more distant, more dangerous. I think that's what makes me different from Dad and from you. You were good people, always seeing life with kind eyes. I can't be like that. The room remained still, as though the house itself had been trapped in the gravity of those words. It was as if the walls absorbed his pain and kept it within every crack, every restored piece of furniture, every corner that still smelled of the past. Edward watched him silently from afar, his face heavy with a strange burden, a mixture of pain, understanding, and absolute respect for the confession Nate had just given. Nate took a deep breath, eyes fixed on the urn resting on the shelf. Outside, the overcast Forks sky barely filtered a dim gray light through the windows, bathing the room in melancholy, a gray seemingly crafted to enclose his grief. I've really tried to leave everything behind, he began, his voice low and restrained, every word weighed down by an unbearable heaviness. You, Dad, and Mom would have wanted me to move on, not to let anger dictate my path. But every day, every hour, every minute of the day, I am furious. Nate's hands clenched tightly, veins taut beneath his pale skin, as if his fingers were trying to hold on to the fury consuming him. I'm furious with the one who killed you. I'm furious I didn't make the man who killed Dad suffer more. And I'm furious that the ones who killed Mom are still out there, free, as if nothing happened. As if her life had been as worthless as a stone kicked along the road. His brow furrowed harshly, and his crimson eyes burned with a searing glow, barely restrained. It's almost as if they were mocking me, he whispered, his voice rough, breaking. Mocking my pain. He fell silent again, jaw clenched, chest rigid, as though every breath was a battle against the storm raging inside him. I don't understand, Nate continued, and though he tried to mask his words with irony, his voice was fractured, as if he spoke from a crack that could never be sealed. It's almost like some cruel joke, don't you think? Every person I love is torn from my life as if I don't deserve that kind of happiness. He paused for a long moment, his gaze lost in some distant memory, as though his mind had traveled back years in the blink of an eye. When Dad and Mom died, I promised myself I'd never let anyone get too close again. Not even you. I convinced myself that the only way to survive was to keep everyone away, to build a wall between me and the rest of the world. When I came to Forks, all I thought was to live with you for a couple of months, endure until I turned 18, and then disappear. Leave without looking back. The sharpness in his voice softened slightly, as though a ray of tenderness had pierced through his armor. His features softened for a second, but it was a moment so fragile it seemed it could shatter with a sigh. But it was inevitable to grow fond of you, wasn't it? With your endless patience, with your way of being so loving without needing words. You never tried to replace Mom and Dad. You never tried to chain me down, never tried to mold me. You gave me freedom, and even with all my arrogance, I got used to you. To your gentle laugh, to the way you called my name as if everything was okay. He leaned forward slightly, his voice trembling faintly. And still, I couldn't do anything to protect you. Nate closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain something heavier than any physical strength he possessed. When he spoke again, it was with a twisted, bitter smile, almost cruel toward himself. I must seem fake, right? Talking about pain when I can't even cry for you. I think about it, and I hate myself inside. I wish I could cry right now. But that's something I left behind when I accepted what I am. Something I sacrificed to have the strength to protect, to never break again. He inhaled deeply, the air heavy in his lungs as though he carried an invisible stone. Every word from his lips seemed to tear another piece of his soul away. I know I took too long. That I failed. I failed you, Dad, Mom. I failed everyone. But it won't happen again, I swear it. Even if I have to tear the world apart with my nails and teeth, I'll never let anyone hurt the people I love again. The room fell into a dense silence, a void that pressed on the chest. The air felt colder, stiller, as if even the day respected his confession. After a long sigh, Nate slipped a hand into his pocket. His fingers, usually firm, searched clumsily, as though the weight of what he carried made him a child again, unsure. I won't be able to visit you often, Grandma, he murmured, his voice artificially calm, like a veneer covering a turbulent ocean. It's hard for me to be around people. And it would be selfish of me to take you with me. As you would say, it would be a sin to deprive others of your company. A faint, dim smile appeared on his face, just a shadow of what it once had been. But at least I want to leave you something, something to keep you company. He carefully took out a small cloth pouch. He held it as though it contained a sacred secret, and when he opened it, the metallic gleam of two rings reflected in the dim light. They were his parents' rings. He took them with reverent care, as though afraid they might break, and placed them beside the urn. I think it's only fair that Dad and Mom keep you company, he whispered softly. I guess they'll have plenty to talk about, after so long apart. His gaze sank into that vessel, fixed on the ashes of the only figure who had managed to soften his life in Forks. For a moment, his mask slipped, and the emptiness in his eyes was so vast it seemed ready to swallow everything around him. Just wait for me, he added in a low, trembling voice. I have too many things to settle, but when it's done, I'll come for you. Maybe by then, I'll have a home with Alice. A place where nothing and no one can ever threaten us again. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy as a gravestone. Nate remained still, trapped in his inner world, where pain and rage entwined until they were indistinguishable. Finally, he took a deep breath. With mechanical movements, he put his hood and sunglasses back on, as though wrapping himself once more in the armor that kept him standing. He turned toward Edward, his voice solemn, almost a decree. Now then, you were with her in her final moments. Tell me, what was she thinking? Edward, who had witnessed in complete silence that monologue of scars and confessions, was left speechless. He had seen Nate in many forms since he arrived in Forks, as a latent threat, an unexpected ally, someone relaxed, even in love. But never like this, so vulnerable, so human in the middle of his darkness. That vision only fueled the guilt consuming him. Almost stammering, he answered. At first, nothing. When the paramedics took her, she was unconscious. But I stayed with her during her last minutes, and she wasn't scared, or in pain. She was only worried about you. Her greatest concern was knowing she was leaving you alone. Nate listened intently. At first, his face softened, but as the words sank in, his expression hardened. He lowered his glasses just enough for the blaze of his anger to cut directly toward Edward. Now answer me, where were you when the attack happened? The weight of the question crushed Edward like a slab of stone. Guilt pressed him down, cold and sharp. He swallowed hard, his voice rushed, as if trying to justify the unjustifiable. Nate, I never meant for anything to happen to her. That night I stayed with Bella at my house. I believed if anyone came to Forks, they'd come directly for her. The plan was to stay away from town, to protect Charlie and your grandmother while I looked after Bella. Fury erupted across Nate's face. He stepped forward, his voice turning into a whip that slashed through the air. And it never crossed your mind that by leaving Charlie and my grandmother alone, you left them defenseless. You didn't even think of something as basic as contacting the Quileute to keep watch. You wouldn't even have had to think that hard. It's the same thing I did when we went to Phoenix to catch James. Shame suffocated Edward. The thought had never once crossed his mind, and now his mistake towered before him like a mountain he couldn't ignore. Nate gave him no respite. Not only were you careless and stupid, you were weak. You couldn't even finish off that vampire. Edward snapped, raising his voice as if clinging to the last defense. You don't understand. It wasn't just the vampire, Jacob was there too, he was confused and attacked me. I couldn't handle both at the same time while protecting Charlie and Bella. Even without experience, a newborn is stronger, and Jacob, as a wolf, is powerful. Those words broke the last thread. In a blink, Nate was in front of him, seizing his shirt collar with icy brutality. I would have stopped them. If it had been me, that vampire would be ash and everyone would be safe. Your weakness cost an innocent life. Edward tried to pull his hands away, but shock struck him violently. He couldn't move Nate even an inch. Nate wasn't just holding him, he was crushing him with devastating strength. Nate's eyes burned with pure rage. His voice came out venomous, heavy with resentment. Things aren't like they were when we spoke in that forest. You're only still alive out of consideration for your sister. A chill froze Edward's blood. He could hear Nate's thoughts with terrifying clarity, a dark whirlwind where the idea of killing him right there gleamed with dangerous intensity. The silence was unbearable. The tearing of fabric beneath Nate's fingers was the only sound breaking the dense air. Then, an abrupt noise jolted them both, the screech of tires outside, followed by a car door slamming. In perfect sync, like two hunted shadows, Nate and Edward released their grip and vanished upstairs in a rush of air. They had barely left the scene when the front door burst open, and Charlie Swan rushed in with hurried steps, climbing out of his patrol car with his heart pounding and his eyes locked on the interior of the house. Chapter 143. The breathing was a knife stabbing his throat with every stride. The damp forest floor gave way under his boots, soaking his ankles, making it even harder to keep pace, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Behind him, the snap of broken branches and a low, deep, animal growl kept him moving. The air was thick with fog, dense, almost tangible, seeping into his lungs with every painful inhalation. The dark, twisted trunks seemed to close in like bars around his escape, as if the forest itself wanted to trap him. He ran, dodging roots that rose like traps, feeling his heart tear inside his chest. The sound of heavy footsteps followed him with relentless precision, growing closer with every second. Something enormous was behind him. Something that breathed with a wet growl, as if swallowing the night itself. He dared to look back. Through the mist, he glimpsed a copper-colored mass gliding between the trees with impossible agility for its size. Two eyes shone in the darkness, wild, reflecting a primal fury. Fear shook him so violently that he barely noticed the root that caught his foot. He stumbled, almost falling, but forced himself to keep going, staggering, his throat burning like fire. He ran without direction, with the sole goal of not being caught, until desperation pushed him to glance over his shoulder again. A grave mistake. Time seemed to slow. As his head turned, his body collided violently with something hard, solid, immovable like a wall. The impact threw him to the ground. His breath was knocked out of him, and the world spun chaotically. The smell of wet earth filled his nose as his face slammed into the mud. Dazed, he slowly lifted his gaze. In front of him, very close, impossible eyes watched him, red as burning embers, intense, too human to belong to an animal, and too inhuman to belong to a man. Panic strangled his throat. There was no air, no way out. A blink later, he bolted upright, gasping as if he had nearly drowned. Sweat ran down his temples, his chest heaving violently with each inhalation. Everything was dark except for the familiar silhouette of his room, dimly illuminated by the gray light filtering through the window. It was only a dream. A nightmare. Charlie Swan brought a hand to his face, trying to calm the trembling that still shook his fingers. The memory of those eyes haunted him even awake. Charlie Pav. Charlie rose heavily, as if still carrying the suffocating weight of his nightmare on his chest. Every movement seemed to drag with it a dense, almost physical fatigue. He stood slowly, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly, letting out a low growl. He had never liked weekday days off. They always felt useless, a waste. But now he hated them more than ever. He would have preferred 1,000 times to bury himself in work at the station. His co-workers, however, had insisted he take a break. They said he seemed absent, as if walking with his mind elsewhere. Charlie frowned at the thought. He hated being treated delicately, as if he would break at the slightest touch. He glanced at the clock on his nightstand. Dawn had barely passed, the light filtered through Fork's gray clouds, tinting the room with a cold, whitish hue. Bella would be ready for school in a matter of minutes. Dragging his feet to the bathroom, he splashed his face with ice-cold water. The shock made him squeeze his eyes shut as if the cold could erase the traces of the nightmare. He paused a second in front of the mirror, examining his reflection under the yellowish light. His mustache was in place, trimmed with the precision he always maintained, but the surrounding beard had grown out wildly, unkempt. Lately, he hadn't bothered with the razor, and this morning would be no exception. With a heavy, resigned sigh, he took a quick shower and dressed in comfortable clothes, something simple in case he needed to go out. Downstairs, the faint smell of toast and coffee greeted him, a reminder of routine. He found Bella in the kitchen, quietly having breakfast. That morning, she seemed subdued, eyes fixed on her plate. Yet when she noticed him, she looked up and gave a small, forced smile, showing him her breakfast as if trying to comfort him with a simple gesture. Charlie silently appreciated it. He had woken up later than usual and had no energy to cook. He sat with her but immediately noticed something strange. Bella was unusually quiet. Charlie tried to lighten the mood, forcing a spark of cheer into his voice. Ready for school, Bells. Bella nodded without looking at him, shoving the last bits of toast into her mouth. Then she got up from the table in a hurry, as if trying to escape the conversation. Charlie watched her, puzzled. What's wrong? Edward isn't here to pick you up yet. Bella's expression tightened immediately, discomfort evident. She walked toward the door without looking at him. No, this week I'll go alone. Charlie rose, following her with concern, frowning. What's wrong? Did you fight? Did he do something to you? She stopped abruptly, turning to him. No, Dad, it's nothing. I just told him I wanted to go in my truck. Besides, I'll see him at school. Nothing's wrong. He observed her silently. It was obvious she was lying, but he didn't press. His frown stayed, but he swallowed his questions. Bella moved to the threshold of the door, and before leaving, turned to him again, her voice lower, almost worried. Hey, Dad, are you staying home all day? Charlie felt uneasy. He brought a hand to his belt, trying to sound casual, though inside he burned with unease. No, daughter, I'll go out to eat or something. Don't worry. She nodded, though not entirely convinced. The morning had slipped by, and it was already late. With a small wave, she climbed into her truck and drove off to school. Charlie remained on the porch, watching her disappear down the wet street, with a sharp sensation that something was off. The fog hung between the trees like a thick veil, and for a moment he thought he saw a shadow moving among them. He blinked, and there was nothing. The memory of the red eyes returned, and a shiver ran down his spine. For a second, his heart jumped, a sudden reminder of his own vulnerability piercing his chest. He forced himself to breathe deeply and stay calm. He wasn't the kind of man who let panic take over. He couldn't afford it, not for Bella. As the head of the household, he had to be a rock, a firm anchor in his daughter's routine, even if inside he felt as fragile as a paper leaf, light and trembling, at the mercy of the wind of his own thoughts. Dragging his feet, he returned to the kitchen to finish his breakfast. He wasn't really hungry, but he knew he needed something in his stomach, a minimal fuel to sustain him through the day. Every bite felt heavy, as if the weight of his thoughts had soaked into the food, turning the simplest act into an added effort. His movements were slow, mechanical, barely conscious, as he chewed without truly tasting. When he finished, he went to the fridge and took out a can of beer. He sat on the couch without turning on the TV, letting the silence envelop him. A heavy, dense silence that seemed to absorb any spark of cheer. For a moment, he considered calling Billy or Harry but immediately dismissed it. He had insisted too many times, they were always busy. The thought pushed him back in time, remembering his adolescence. All the friends from the reservation went out together, and he was left out, observing from a distance. Then there was Richard, his only friend, not from the reservation, but now no one lived in town. A brief spark of nostalgia crossed his eyes. He had no one to share his silences with, no one to confide in. He looked at the unopened beer, exhaling a deep sigh that seemed to carry all the sleepless hours and unresolved thoughts. He lifted it, staring at it a moment longer, evaluating whether it was worth opening, and finally returned it to the fridge. Thinking of Richard made him uncomfortable, a weight on his chest mixed with sadness and guilt, a sensation pushing him to do anything to avoid being trapped in those memories. He stood and went to his toolbox with a heavy, almost brusque gesture. He opened the lid, rummaged a little inside, and pulled out a belt loaded with tools and work utensils. He slung it over his shoulder, letting its weight remind him that there were things to do, concrete objectives, however small, to keep him moving. He walked to the door, steps slow but determined, with no hurry or urgency, just moving, as if movement alone was enough to avoid getting trapped in his thoughts. Before opening the door, he paused, as if a late thought came to mind. He went back to the kitchen and grabbed a couple of fruits, carefully placing them in a paper bag. He held them for a moment, lost in thought, weighing whether he would really need them. But he didn't let the moment stretch too long, he had to move on. With the belt on his shoulder and the bag of fruit in hand, he walked to the patrol car. He climbed in, closing the door with a dry click echoing in the silent garage. He started the engine and heard the familiar roar, a constant sound that seemed to bring a minimal sense of stability. He drove away from his house along the wet, empty streets, with the fog clinging to asphalt and trees, the sensation of daily routine slowly, joylessly beginning, accompanying him like a silent weight. As he drove, Charlie's gaze wandered over the few people walking along the street. The day was still fresh and humid, the typical Forks fog hanging low over asphalt and rooftops. Not many people were out, it was early, a weekday, and the town was still waking calmly. Even so, seeing smiling faces and light conversations gave him a slight relief, a small warmth seeping through the heaviness of his mood. It was like watching a picture of life going on while he remained trapped in his gray routine. He continued along the route he knew too well, the same one he had traveled for months, etched in his memory as much as the asphalt in front of him. Every curve, every leaning tree, every pothole seemed memorized. He drove slowly, letting the neatly trimmed gardens, familiar houses, and messy mailboxes pass before his eyes. The damp mist tangled with lampposts and roofs, and the garden shrubs seemed asleep, wrapped in a dense silence contrasting with the distant murmur of the town. When the last familiar houses were behind him and the flow of people had disappeared, he finally reached his destination, Mrs. Winter's house. A small, almost involuntary smile appeared on his face at the sight of the blooming garden. For months he had worried nothing would grow there, that the plants would die without care, but apparently, his efforts had paid off. The colorful flowers, still wet with morning dew, offered a brief moment of quiet beauty. He began slowing down until stopping in front of the main door, letting out a small sigh, a subtle gesture that seemed to release some of the tension in his shoulders. He was about to grab the belt and the paper bag he had left on the passenger seat, when something caught his eye in the window. There, in profile, arms raised to the height of the neck, he saw a hooded figure. At first glance, it looked like a young man holding something, but the hood and sunglasses gave it a strange, unsettling air. Charlie's breath caught for a moment, his chest tightened and a fleeting memory returned. Those horrible red eyes, intense and impossible. His heart skipped a beat, and for a second, time seemed to stop. But when he blinked, the window was empty, showing the house alone as always. Charlie got out of the car quickly, leaving the belt and bag on the seat without thinking. He didn't even make sure the door was fully closed. With hurried steps, still unsure exactly what he was doing, he ran toward the house, with the confusing feeling of fleeing something that might only exist in his mind. His head spun, replaying memories and sensations he couldn't decipher. He flung the door open roughly. The keys nearly fell, but he managed to get inside. His breath came fast and shallow, his heart pounding. When about to cross the threshold, he noticed that inside, there was no one. He forced himself to take a deep breath and calm down, leaning on the doorframe. The house was empty, silent, and calm, exactly as always. The walls seemed to absorb any sound, and the echo of his own steps confirmed his suspicion. It was evident that everything had been a trick of his imagination, yet a spark of doubt ignited in his mind, faint but persistent. Cautiously, he began walking through the house, observing every corner carefully. Every object, every piece of furniture, seemed exactly as he had left it. He glanced at the stairs, no sound, no movement. Finally, he let out a long sigh and stood still in the middle of the dining room for a few seconds, letting his breathing return to a steadier rhythm. When he felt calmer, he moved toward the shelf where Mrs. Winter's ashes rested. His fingers brushed the urn delicately, almost as if this were his way of offering a greeting. But then something made him stop. Something that hadn't been there before caught his attention. A pair of rings, carefully placed, rested naturally beside the urn, almost like a small offering. For a second, Charlie's brow furrowed, and he looked around as if expecting someone to appear to claim the rings. The surprise in his eyes mixed with a faint sense of unease. Chapter 144. If you want to support or read some advanced chapters +10, please follow me on patreon.com/jayjayemp. The morning light timidly filtered through the second-floor windows, diffused by the dense, persistent fog that covered Forks like a damp veil. The rays barely managed to slip between the heavy curtains, drawing pale lines across the wooden floor and illuminating particles of dust floating in the still air. The atmosphere held that thick stillness that seemed to turn every second into a suspended moment. Nate and Edward remained there, motionless, suppressing even the slightest movement. They could have been mistaken for figures carved in stone if not for the intermittent blink in Edward's eyes and the barely perceptible tension in Nate's jaw. Silence clung to the walls, broken only by sporadic creaks of the house, as if the wood itself were breathing. Downstairs, Charlie Swan stood in front of the shelf that held Nate's grandmother's urn. His posture spoke louder than any gesture. Heavy shoulders, nervous hands, uneven breathing rising and falling like waves. Edward turned his head toward Nate, his eyes glinting with a hint of warning. With a slight nod, he indicated the window, suggesting they leave while they still had the chance. But Nate merely shook his head, with that serene obstinacy so characteristic of him. There was no need to get closer, no need to see with their eyes what they already perceived with their sharp senses. Charlie's confused heartbeat, the metallic clink of his rings brushing together, the bitter scent of doubt in the air, all narrated the scene with relentless precision. Charlie examined the rings with a deeply furrowed brow, as if a truth eluded him in this discovery. His pupils roamed the room with restrained anxiety, searching for an invisible presence, a sign that he was not alone. Finally, Almost against his own will, he let out a low, uncertain voice. Is anyone there? The sound hung in the air, devoured by the silence. Edward pressed his lips together and glanced at Nate out of the corner of his eye. The other vampire's impassive expression could be both a promise of patience and a prelude to unexpected action. Edward knew him well enough to fear both possibilities. But Nate did not move, he remained rooted in the shadows, watching with unwavering attention. A different sound broke the tension. Soft, mundane. The light tapping of claws against the wood. The grandmother's old tabby cat descended the stairs with a surprisingly agile step for its age, tail held high and eyes gleaming with familiarity. It passed by the two vampires as if they were mere shadows, as if their supernatural nature did not exist in its feline world. They followed it with reverent silence, and the animal, oblivious to the tension, disappeared toward the first floor. Charlie received it with a faint smile, genuine in its simplicity. I don't think even my daughter greets me with this much joy, you furball. He picked it up with affectionate clumsiness, and the cat, resigned and tired, allowed itself to be held without resistance. That contact seemed to soften the hard lines of Charlie's face. Slowly, he placed the rings next to the urn, and the metallic sound against the wood was almost a relief. He let out a long sigh, as if exhaling the air could also release some of the weight pressing on his chest. I'll work on those wobbly chairs today, he murmured, stroking the cat's back, and then I'll feed you. He set it carefully on the floor, as if afraid of breaking something fragile, and walked toward the door. His stride was no longer that of the upset man who had burst in minutes before, he seemed a little lighter, although the shadow of sadness still accompanied him. Upstairs, Nate tracked every gesture, every pause, with attention that went beyond mere curiosity. When Charlie went out to the patrol car to retrieve what he had forgotten, Nate finally leaned toward the staircase, allowing the pale light to just brush his face. The hardness of his expression contrasted with the contradiction beneath, a mix of contained melancholy and inner conflict, as if the scene had stirred something deep within him, something he could not, or would not, explain. Edward, a few steps behind, watched silently. He knew Nate would not ask, at least not yet, but he could not ignore the unease building in his chest. Nate had that charged look, that complicated expression, as if he saw in Charlie something more than Edward could comprehend. Without turning to look at him, Nate whispered. It was so low that to a human ear it would have sounded like the rustle of a breeze through the curtains, but Edward heard it with perfect clarity, each word vibrating in the silence of the second floor. What was Charlie thinking? Edward remained silent for a moment, trying to organize his thoughts before responding. His gaze hardened, and the muscles of his jaw tensed as if each word bore its own weight. His thoughts are always short phrases. I can't read his mind clearly, it never flows like others. But, he lowered his gaze slightly, inhaling the air thick with dust and old wood, I think things are worse than we thought. Charlie is beginning to remember what happened the night your grandmother died. Nate barely turned his head, his red eyes fixed on Edward, shining with an intensity that seemed to pierce the darkness of his sunglasses. Be more precise, he demanded, in a tone that left no room for doubt. Edward frowned, uncomfortable, as if the words he had to speak carried an edge. When he saw you for a second from his patrol car, he mistook you for Riley. He thought it immediately. He's very nervous. And if he follows that thread, if he keeps exploring that idea, he'll end up convinced that what he saw that night was real. We'll need to find a way soon to make sure none of that stays in his mind. Nate remained still for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, each inhalation infused with the scent of old wood, worn furniture, and curtain fabric. Beneath it all, he still sensed Charlie's trace, his fear and confusion hanging in the air like a persistent echo. When he exhaled, his gaze had sharpened, knife-like. His shoulders straightened, tense, and without a word, he raised his hand in a brief signal to Edward. In the blink of an eye, both vanished from the room. They leapt from the second-floor window like projectiles, their bodies merging with the wind. They cared nothing for remaining unseen, the only drive was the need to put distance between themselves and the house. They ran with ferocious speed, so extreme that the garden and yard trees seemed to open before them and close again in a blink, leaving a trail of disturbed leaves and soil. The ground creaked beneath their light feet, and the shadows of the trees stretched and contorted around them, as if trying to trap them. They pressed deeper into the forest, moving further from the house and any human sound, until only tall, dense trunks remained, surrounding them like pillars of an ancient natural temple. Moisture clung to their clothes and skin, filling each breath with an earthy scent that reminded them they were far from the human world. Finally, when the thicket had completely engulfed them, Nate stopped abruptly. Branches creaked under his boots, and the forest seemed to close in around them, trapping them in expectant silence. His rigid body, eyes burning with dark determination, reflected an internal conflict on the verge of overflowing. The stillness around them was not merely an absence of sound, but an intense presence, as if nature itself held its breath, waiting for the decision he was about to make. Edward halted barely a meter behind him, turning with a furrowed brow, feeling the tension radiating from Nate like a pulse vibrating in the forest's damp air. Though his body was immortal, Nate felt the weight of fatigue that went beyond the physical. Every step, every breath, seemed to drag echoes of the past. Speaking with his grandmother's urn had been complicated, confronting memories that refused to stay buried and shadows that crept into the corners of his mind. Now, seeing Charlie so clearly exhausted, shoulders slumped under the weight of guilt and eyes heavy with concern, added another layer of tension to his heart. Nate had never blamed Charlie. He was only a human trapped in a world he could not understand, another victim of circumstances beyond his control, just as Nate's own grandmother had been. The scene before him became increasingly complex and oppressive. Not only did he need to address the matter with the Quiulets and ensure Charlie understood that what he had seen that night had not happened, but he also felt compelled to alleviate the guilt consuming the man. Perhaps it was not an immediate priority, but Nate could not bear to leave Charlie trapped in torment. In his mind, a plan began to form, to invent an explanation convincing enough for Charlie to understand that none of what had happened was his fault, knowing that any conversation would have to be direct, clear, and face to face. This certainty added complexity to the plan, but there was no alternative. The only obstacle was something Nate did not want to admit. When he came within a few steps of Charlie, the man's scent sharpened his self-control to a dangerous limit. For a moment, he was tempted to approach, to give in to the primitive urge he usually repressed effortlessly. But this time, his unruly emotions, the same ones that almost always kept him angry, worked in his favor. They offered him more precise, firmer control than he would have had in a normal situation. Yet Nate knew this advantage was temporary. Every breath of Charlie's, every small gesture, seemed to bring him closer to a threshold he was not sure he could hold for long. The confidence to face him without succumbing to the thirst he provoked had not yet developed. He was not ready to confront him directly without his vampiric nature threatening to break the delicate restraint he had managed to maintain so far. He lifted his gaze, meeting Edward's eyes. A fleeting, ironic thought crossed his mind. If he had felt that kind of thirst being so close to Charlie, what would happen near Bella? According to other vampires' stories, her scent could endanger any of their species' self-control. Nate decided not to explore that idea. He had more immediate and urgent problems to attend to. First, dealing with the Quiulets. Later, once the treaty was restored, he would decide how to handle the situation with Charlie and alleviate the guilt consuming him. He made a silent vow. Before leaving Forks again to pursue Riley, he would do everything in his power to protect Charlie and ensure he was not trapped in guilt or fear. It was the least he could offer. Nate took a deep breath, letting the forest's humidity and the mixed scents of earth, leaves, and bark settle around him, reinforcing his resolve. For now, the priority was the present. First, find Jacob and restore the treaty, then see how to resolve the rest. Nate looked at Edward with contained intensity, his tone low but loaded with reproach. All this matter with the Quiulets and Charlie, it's your fault, Edward. If you had kept your promise, none of this would have happened. Nothing would have threatened your family, nothing would have pulled you away from Bella, and nothing would endanger her father. Edward remained silent, unable to offer excuses. After witnessing Nate's fury minutes earlier, when he had grabbed him by the neck in his grandmother's house, he knew any explanation would sound hollow. There were no arguments that could dismantle Nate's determination. Nate continued, his voice sharper, letting each word sink in. How willing are you to fix everything? Edward did not hesitate. Urgency and responsibility pushed him to speak quickly, almost tripping over his own words. Of course I am. I'll do anything to fix this problem. Nate nodded slowly, though his eyes seemed lost in deeper thoughts. His tone, calm but icy, made it clear he was serious. I have a method to solve everything quickly, but you'll have to do exactly as I say and tell Carlisle or the rest of your family nothing. If I find out you spoke, it won't matter that you're Alice's brother, that won't save you from what I'll do. He paused, letting the silence fill the space between them, heavy like the fog enveloping the forest. Then his final words cut the air like a blade. What's your decision? Do you want to keep everyone safe? Or are you going to fix the problem you've gotten everyone into? Edward felt the pressure of Nate's gaze pinned on him. Each passing second without a response seemed to stretch the tension to the breaking point. He knew there was no turning back. His next actions would define the safety of those he loved, and any mistake would have irreversible consequences. Finally, he took a deep breath and, with the firmness the situation demanded, replied, "I'll do whatever is necessary." "I'm listening, Nate. Tell me what I must do."